As a business owner, you measure the leads that come through your business, traffic that comes to your website, how much money you've made, profit losses, all those things. But how frequently should you be tracking the metrics of your podcast? In this podcast episode, I'm going to be telling you exactly how frequently you should measure your podcast and what you should be looking at in order to make sure that you're not overwhelmed, wasting time, or when it's too late to track those metrics. Because let's be honest, there's a lot of moving pieces in our business, so I totally understand that sometimes tracking your podcast progress is the last thing you want to do. So in this podcast episode, we're going to go over all of those things. And I'm Anna. I'm the founder of The Podcast Space. I'm a podcast marketer, content strategist that helps business owners better utilize their podcast so they can become the thought leader and raise the awareness about their brand so that their show becomes successful and therefore them too. Let's dive right into this episode. For most podcast hosts that run a business, they want to measure all the other things. But when you are optimizing your podcast to actually bring you business or to bring you leads or speaking opportunities or increase the digital footprint of your business, it can be very overwhelming to look at all the things that you got to measure. On your newsletter, you're measuring your subscriber list, the open rate, the click-through rate, the responses. When you're looking at your social media, you're looking at those interaction responses, the growth of your account. And on your podcast, it may feel like you're looking at a lot of different metrics. There's a lot of conversation going around, and downloads are not the only thing that you should be looking into. I've covered a few things in this season about more metrics that you should be looking at. But when we're looking at the frequency, I want you to understand that it's not just something that you do every single week, that you got to go on the dashboard every day to measure that progress. Remember that podcast growth is done long-term, and it's important to have a holistic marketing strategy when you're looking at your podcast so that you're not missing out on feedback that could have been important that you had no idea that came from the podcast. And this is like a side note, but so many podcasters I speak to have that form on the website saying like, contact us. And there's this one drop-down menu that can really help you measure podcast growth and podcast success that is to actually include the podcast on that drop-down menu that says, how did you hear about us? A lot of clients don't even have that. If you don't have that and you have access to a computer, go do it right now, because you will be surprised about the amount of interactions that you will get out of your podcast. And if you're not putting it there, people may not convey that information to you, may not volunteer that information. And so it's important when you're looking at where to invest your money in the following year, in the following quarter. Those are like some little things that you can do. But let's go back. Let's go back into the metrics, how to measure, when to measure, and what you should keep in mind. First things first, you should do a quarterly check. And again, every quarter, you're probably looking at your profits and loss, and you're going to be looking at a lot of things that worked in your business. You have to add the podcast to it, even though we all talk about how podcasting is like the long-term impact, but you can really assess some trends of topics, of episode consumption, of subscriber growth or decrease, and how many people are actually joining your newsletter or how many people are actually visiting the podcast page, right? So looking at quarterly data is like the ideal, because it's not that you're doing it every month. Like the month to me as a business owner flies by. Being able to look at quarterly data is very important. Again, you can track other stuff, but like to sit down and look at what actually is performing well and making decisions, you can definitely do that every quarter. Another reason why you should look at quarterly is because if you are hosting a podcast that is episodic, so not seasonal, you will look at trends. And I always tell clients, it's so important to feature kind of current events in what's going on. So something that was on the news, something that you're noticing some traction, your audience is talking a lot about these things. So if you're trying some of these things, by the end of the quarter, you'll be able to look into if that, for instance, talking about that thing that was on the news really help you get a bump in downloads in comparison to talking about evergreen stuff. To me personally, that actually was a really interesting shift when I started talking about podcasting reports that were coming out with podcast data, podcast listenership information. Those episodes, when I come out of podcast conferences, they always perform really well because, again, data is one of the things that I talk about as a content pillar. And I noticed that when I was talking about less evergreen things, so more time sensitive, those were performing really well. So that's definitely something that I'm going to be incorporating in 2025 because I noticed that it was getting me a lot of new listeners, or people were coming to me and saying, I really enjoy what you said about this. Can we book a call? Some of these things that we think, it's not going to be worthwhile, when you're looking at the data, when you're looking at the interactions on social media and tracking that, you'll be like, it actually is worth it. But again, only the data will tell you that if it is performing or not. Something else to consider is that if you have an ad, if you're doing an ad campaign and you have a sponsorship, or if you're trying to measure results, it can take up to 6 weeks for you to get the results out of a campaign you did. And it sounds crazy, but think about how you consume podcasts. Many times life gets in the way and you weren't able to consume all the podcasts that you wanted to consume. And so it ended up being that only 2 weeks later, you were able to listen to that podcast episode. And if it had something that you were interested in that you maybe wanted to check out, it may take a while for you to have that behavior to go and check, right? So if you have ads, it's going to take a little bit of time to see how they perform. And again, looking at quarters, if you're thinking about pitching a brand to continue that sponsorship and you're wanting to look at the data, if you're looking at the quarter versus doing it only twice a year or only once a year, you're not going to be able to really make that in time to get that budget approved. So it's not that you approach a brand unless they're small and they say, yeah, sure, let's renew it again. Let's run more ads. Doing a quarterly deep dive is going to help you get tighter on those results. Doing a quarterly check also enables you to pick up on things that may be happening. So for instance, every single time there's a new iOS update, an Apple update, it impacts podcasts. It's getting better, but it's getting more accurate. So when you're looking at Apple Podcast Dashboard, you will see that maybe a new update impacted the reach of your podcast, the engagement of your podcast, the downloads. And so you're able to pinpoint those elements. I often talk about how when I went on a sabbatical of a month, my podcast got a 1,200% increase in downloads. And I was like, what is this? What is happening? Why is my podcast growing like crazy? And then I looked at Apple Podcast Dashboard and I noticed that data wasn't there. And so I was like, okay, bots. All right. So if it had been like 8 months later, I would not have been able to access that data on Apple Podcasts. So basically, a lot of the nitty-gritty, when you start going into more in detail about the data, you don't get access to it. You just get maybe 60 or 90 days. And being able to dive into that specific granular level is going to help you figure out, okay, if I had a very crazy increase on my podcast dashboard, but then that dashboard also said like most of the traffic came through Apple Podcasts, and you go there like, that isn't there. So you're able to make those detective moments happen with more accuracy. So you're able to put on your detective hat and act on situations. Like, for instance, let's say you have a spike in downloads. It could be that maybe a podcast guesting opportunity that you did resulted in podcast downloads. So you can say, okay, in this quarter, I know that I guested on all of these places. You can pinpoint and attribute the growth to that and do more of those guesting opportunities. Pitch yourself on that podcast again, or do less if you saw no growth. Another thing about quarterly check-ins is that they enable you to make better decision-making and faster. So instead of you sitting and waiting, again, if you're a business owner, you're likely making decisions on your business very fast, right? If something isn't working, you just shift and pivot. It's the same thing for your podcast. You should be able to make those decisions based on data. If after a quarter, you notice that maybe podcast interviews are not performing well, you shift into solos. Or if you've been doing a lot of really long episodes, and you look at the consumption data and it's not working, so you're going to be reining all of that back and say, let's start doing shorter episodes. Maybe let's break those episodes in 2 parts, right? So you're really looking at your return on investment on the podcast, your time invested, and you're making better decisions about those, and you're not waiting for half the year to make those decisions. So it's really important to think about, if you're, again, investing a lot of your marketing in some of these things, that you're paying attention to how those are performing, or if those are not performing, and is it down to any updates? So quarterly deep dives are going to help you make those decisions in where you're investing your time in your marketing and how to pivot. And so another one, number 3, basically is to give you enough time to make decisions, because a lot of times, again, it's like helping you making decisions and not take that long to make those business decisions. But at the same time, some events, as I said, for instance, about the ads, will take time to perform. And so you need to be able to use real data and accurate data to make those decisions. You can't just say, oh, this episode didn't perform, let's shift. Maybe you started pushing more, for instance, like on Spotify, and people to use Spotify versus any other platform. And so those decisions take time. New user behaviors take time to take effect. That's something that you need to consider. And then on the opposite spectrum, doing quarterly check-ins doesn't overwhelm you, and it limits the space and time for analysis paralysis. I've been with clients when we were looking at the whole year, and at some point they got so confused. They were like, oh my gosh, hang on, let's break it down to quarter again, because what were the episodes that really worked? When you're doing a deep dive on a quarterly basis, for instance, I have a few episodes that are on pages that perform really well on Google. The episode about the 7 goals that you can set up for your podcast, the types of podcast listeners you can have. Those are 2 that perform really well. So I know already those are winners. So if I want to do a replay, or I want to refer that to someone, I know that those are some episodes that do very well. But if I wanted to test other technologies, or if I wanted to make sure that I'm looking at data, what worked, if you're going through a very big universe of data, it may be really hard to make those decisions and to pinpoint exactly what led to this and what led to that when we're looking at your marketing. And so this is very obvious when you're shifting formats, when you're shifting, for instance, things that you're testing on like ads or dynamic ads or even small tweaks. You may not remember like that small tweak unless you took notes. What happened on that episode that you did, maybe a call to action consistently about growing your newsletter. And then last but not least, a 5th reason why you should do quarterly check-ins, it's because it helps you align business pivots with a podcast. And I've done that last year. In 2023, I started looking and seeing that interviews were not performing as well as solos. I wanted to apply to a lot of more conferences that were like higher level. And so I decided, okay, you know what? I want to shift the content. And I was able to do that because I was looking at how they were performing. And I was like, the episode consumption is, I think it was like on the 60%. And when I was looking at the following quarter, when I did those shifts, the episode consumption went up to 82. And so I was like, that was worthwhile, right? And so again, it helped me reach my business goals. So when I'm looking as well as the outcomes for the podcast, episode consumption went up. And it really helped me improve the podcast because I was listening to what people were saying. They were like, oh my gosh, these episodes changed my life. This was so great. I cannot believe that I was looking at solos in such a complex way. And so I was leading by showing a lot of these elements instead of just telling them like, hey, just do solos. And I was like, okay, doing solos, and the listener feedback increased massively. So in terms of audience feedback, that was one of the metrics that increased a lot for me. And when you're looking at like the whole year, it's really hard to measure those business changes, especially as I was saying in the beginning of the episode. As a business owner, your business changes very fast. And with a lot of technology changes, it can be hard to measure that in the whole year. So as a business owner, I hope that it made more sense now listening to this episode and how you need to incorporate more of those business practices into the podcast, just like you do your profit and loss, just like how you evaluate what is working and not on the business, and you're maximizing your business's return on investment. The podcast is the same. So these are fundamental parts of business growth and podcast growth that you need to consider. So looking at deep dives that happen every quarter overall are going to help you increase the performance of your podcast, the performance of your business. And if you listen to all of this and you're like, you know what, I definitely need help with this, great. I can help you. I help business owners really align the podcast, understand their data, and making sure that they are utilizing the podcast in a more effective way to grow their business and their influence. So you can book a podcast discovery call on the website is thepodcastspace.com/grow. And it's a free 30-minute discovery call. Just like this, we're talking, it's easy. And we're talking about what your limitations are, your frustrations with the podcast, and the different ways that we can work together to improve your show. So I invite you to visit thepodcastspace.com/grow to get there. And please make sure that you share this podcast with your friends, with anyone who you know that is going to be benefiting from it. Word of mouth is one of the most powerful ways to grow a business, so I would be ever so grateful if you could do that. And hey, if you haven't rated or reviewed the podcast, do that too. I've been Annick Xavier, and I invite you to create imperfect content that moves you forward. I'll see you in the next episode.